first event in this year's symposium. This has been a multi-institutional undertaking quite some time, and in fact, it's gone without remark that this is the 15th annual symposium. Several institutions gave it Augusta, including us, and the Center for the Study of History, and Augusta, and the Lizzie Grant Museum, and the Augusta Museum of History that organized together. And a gratifying experience, I think, for all involved. My role here this evening is simple. I'm here to introduce the introducer. So I'm pleased to do that. Leanne Caldwell has been the linchpin in this effort over these many years, and were it not for Dr. Caldwell, this would not have happened. Here I'm here.
Actually, he was just supposed to welcome you to the Mars. So I want to begin by saying this is the Edward J. Cashin Jr. Memorial Wilson Symposium. And Cashin founded the symposium in 1992, or three, after Historic Augusta acquired the Woodrow Wilson House, and he wanted to bring some study, some scholarly study into Wilson in his times, and we've been doing it ever since. So that's what, 32 years now. And then when the Civil War centennial came up, came up, this group of organizations in town got together, and for all these years we've been working together. We actually won an award from the Georgia Historical Society because they couldn't believe that many nonprofits would collaborate with each other every year, and so they thought that was reward worthy. So the symposium is an important part of bringing scholarship to Augusta, and you're going to hear a wonderful talk tonight and 3 talks tomorrow. We normally do something that relates not necessarily to Woodrow Wilson, but to Woodrow Wilson's times. But this year and the next couple of years, we're going to be concentrating on the American Revolution because we're going to have a birthday next July. Ed would love this because he loved the Revolutionary period. His books, many of his books, study the Revolution in the South and the Revolution in Augusta. So I thought he would give me permission to kind of get a little bit off subject and go to the Revolution. So I want to introduce a really special guest we have tonight, Marianne Cashin. She's with her son, Victor Esposito. Came down from Atlanta, and Ed would be so pleased to know, as I am. All right, I want to thank a few people. This year's sponsors, in addition to the Center for the Study of Georgia History, which was founded by Ed Cashin, Historic Augusta Incorporated, the Morris Museum, the Lucy Laney Museum, the Augusta Historical Society have been the most involved in this year's production. Special thanks to Noelle Salinas in the back, who did all the flyers and publicity and the book flyers back there, and she's very talented, and we appreciate that. And to John McBrayer, who is out putting food out for us for our reception. John not only is handling the reception, but John handled our connections with the Smithsonian Institution, which leads me to my final thing before I introduce you. Now, if you got your flyer, you saw that the speaker tonight was Daniel Piazza from the Smithsonian Institution. Well, guess what? He couldn't come because of the shutdown. We waited and waited, and it got to be 2 weeks out, and it didn't look like anything was going to happen. I started getting a little panicky. And then I remembered a wonderful talk on the Revolution I heard. And so the speaker that I'm going to introduce to you tonight is my pinch hitter, so to speak, because he agreed. Well, it was a very awkward. So I said, Ray, I have a question to ask. Would you be willing to do that talk? And he said, yes. And I said, here guy shows up, I'm not going to need you. But we decided last week that we didn't want the Smithsonian guy anymore this year because it was just too iffy, and Ray agreed to step in. So let me tell you a little bit about Ray. Are we being serenaded tonight? Ray is many of you know him. He's an attorney here in town. But Ray is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Emory University with a major in history. He is also a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School. He served 4 years in the United States Air Force as a JAG attorney for the Air Force. He began his practice of law here in Augusta at the firm of Knox and Zacks, and you may remember Wick Knox that we lost just very recently. Ray was one of the first attorneys to join that firm. They merged with the Atlanta firm of Kilpatrick and Cody, which became an international firm. He specialized in cases involving malpractice, products liability, and electrical and propane gas tragedies and events. He's a member of several professional organizations, which I won't go into all of that. And he said the thing he's proudest of, other than marrying his wife Jean, was being awarded when he graduated from high school with the Medal for Outstanding Student in History. So he has come full circle. Great chat.
Okay. Pardon me. Thank you, Leanne. And I was delighted to be invited to come off the bench and give this talk again. I gave it one time to a small dinner group that we belong to, and the title was meant to be intentionally perplexing. So I hope some of you are perplexed. Some people who've heard this before are not perplexed. But by the end, you'll be unperplexed, I hope. I am not a professional historian nor even an amateur historian, but I am somebody who loves history. And it was really fun to do this. The First World War and how George Washington started it, a friend of mine, when I first talked about this and told him about the talk, looked at me and he said, "Ray, didn't George Washington die in 1799? And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Didn't the war start in August of 1914? And I said, "It depends upon which war." So, and I'll explain, and he was perplexed. And some of you may be perplexed by this, but again, I hope it becomes clear. George Washington, the way it begins, to go to the beginning of George Washington, he started off as a surveyor, really when he was very young. He was in his late teens, became a very experienced surveyor in the areas of Western Virginia, Pennsylvania. Surveyors were needed then because there were questions about boundaries of the colonies. How far did they go? Where did they go? And there were also surveyors were needed because there were being claims made for various lands, and the lines had to be established for who owned what. And it was really George's start as a surveyor and his experience and knowledge in the wilderness that led to the story that's going to be told here. After he stopped being a surveyor in 1752, he wound up being promoted, offered to serve as a major in the Virginia militia, starting at that point in time. And during that initial period of time where he became a major in the Virginia militia, the governor of Virginia gave him a couple of assignments. And the first of those was to do something that involved the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River Valley, as you will see here, is huge. The Ohio River Valley exists because it was sculpted out by glaciers. And when the glaciers subsided, this is what was left. The Ohio River Valley was a key area during the colonial period and the formation of what was going on with the growth of North America. You can see these various lines here are rivers. Here is the major one, the Ohio River, which goes 981 miles and enters into the Mississippi. It was the I-95, not going north-south, but the I-95 of that era going from where it started to where it went into the Mississippi. And also involving the Ohio, many tributaries, some very major ones, some smaller ones, a lot of streams. In doing the research on this, I saw that it was reported they really didn't know how many river streams that might be related to the Ohio River Valley, but they were a lot. And all of this was important because it permitted growth as the westward expansion was occurring. Just before the French and Indian War, and I think all of you folks who are interested in history, I'm sure know something, at least familiar with the French and Indian War to some degree. Before the French and Indian War started, this is how the claims were being made for areas of control in North America. And you can see that the greatest area in North America, both east and west of the Mississippi, south of Canada, was claimed by the French. The British colonies had very little. Well, this gets to the first mission of George Washington. The governor of Virginia did not like the fact that the French were claiming so much of the territory. And he said, George, your job is to go to the French fort up in northwestern Pennsylvania and tell the French commander that this land belongs to George III of England, our king, and tell him they have to leave. Well, George traversed that area. This is a map. You can tell there were no GPSs, no Apple maps, no Google, no Waze. And the kind of maps that were used were similar to this as they laid out. And it was because of George's expertise in the wilderness and his really significant and great knowledge that he was given the assignment to make that trek, which he did. And he wound up, the group he went with would have traveled like this, dressed like this, would have traveled across rivers, poling them, and it was a very difficult trek. Well, he got up to the fort, the French fort he was assigned to go to, and it was one that was about 30 miles south of the current Erie, Pennsylvania. And he was received politely. George told the French commander that he had been tasked to come there and tell him that you French must leave. The French were very polite, but my French is not good, but the reply was none. And so George wound up going back, reporting to the Virginia governor about what he was told. And the governor in Virginia was not very happy. So he said, George, this time I want you to go and I want you to establish a fort at the convergence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers into the Ohio. And of course he said, yes, sir. And for that job, he was promoted to be a lieutenant colonel. Pardon me. And so he began to make that trek. His job was to go up to that area and establish the groundwork for a fort. One of the events that happened along the way, though, was unpleasant. In southwestern Pennsylvania, he encountered a French patrol, not a large one, but there was a French patrol, and what is called a skirmish. I guess it's called a skirmish because there weren't that many people involved, but it was one that was deadly. And during this, it's called this occurred in Jumonville and Jumonville. I did not take French. Is not good, but this is Jumonville Glen in southwestern Pennsylvania, is where they came across the French patrol. Conflict ensued, and the commander of the French patrol and 9 of his men were killed. 1 survived. There is a conflicting story about who fired the first shot, but an Indian ally, both the French and the Brits had Indian allies, and I'm using the term Indian, not Native American, only because in historical context, even if you read current articles, they will still refer to the allies and Indians, not Native Americans. But and this may have been the Indian ally, but one of the Indian allies reported, well, Washington fired the first shot. Things evolved from that. The French, as you might imagine, were not very enamored of what George and his group did, and they wanted revenge. And so they began to look for George and his soldiers so they could exact revenge. And George knew that the French were coming after him, so he built Fort Necessity. I don't know if many of you have heard that. For a while, I lived up in western Pennsylvania and actually have visited this site. Fort Necessity was a fort, if you can really think of this as a fort. Doesn't look like much of a fort, does it? But he built that so in the expectation that the French were going to be coming after him and his men, and he wanted to have some protection. Unfortunately, not only was the fort not very substantial, but it was built at the lowest point of the surrounding land, so the French could get up and they could fire down, and they had the advantage of the terrain. Because of that, Washington ultimately surrendered, and interestingly, we all know Washington through the Revolutionary War and the battles that he fought, but this is the only time in his entire military career that he ever surrendered. Well, the Battle of Fort Necessity is regarded as the beginning of the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War began in 1754 and lasted to 1763. And as I indicate there, it is accepted that that was the result of what the skirmish that George Washington engaged in at Jumonville Glen. There were battles in North America during this time period of 1754 to 1763. The battles were principally in southwestern Pennsylvania, New York, and Canada. The areas that were of major interest and control, again, get back to the Ohio River. And here you see a representation, panoramic view. The upper river is the Allegheny, the lower is the Monongahela, and there is the Ohio. And it was a particular interest because both the French and the British wanted to have a fort there. They regarded it as extremely strategic. Well, one of the problems also with George being instructed to build a fort, build a fort in this area, even before the skirmish occurred, is that the French already had a fort there. It was Fort Duquesne. And Indian allies, they didn't wear uniforms brightly colored. They wore clothing that allowed them to be more concealed in the wilderness. They didn't stand up and fire muskets at each other in a gentlemanly way. Instead, they fought from behind trees and bushes. And Braddock and his troops were decimated. In fact, Braddock was shot. 3 days later, he died. But it fell upon George Washington to save the day by helping the British get away from the carnage. Washington was not a formal officer in any way involved. The British looked down on the American military personnel. They thought, well, they're not trained like we are. They don't know how to fight like we do. So they were allowed to participate, but not really be in charge of anything. Here, George Washington seized control. He took charge. He led he led their troops away from the battle site. He was very brave, and he had 4 bullet holes in his coat, 1 in his hat, and had a horse shot out from under him, but he did not suffer a scratch. Providence. Eventually, after all of this, however, the events I just described were in July of 1755. I'm not sorry, 1775. Eventually, however, the British were able to take over the area at the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela to form the Ohio, and they were able to build Fort Pitt. What happened was a subsequent British force did amass in 1778, or 58, excuse me, in 1758. And they were able to get the French to abandon the fort. They felt the commander of the Fort Duquesne felt he could not defend the fort. So they left and they burned the fort down and destroyed it. The British built Fort Pitt to replace it. I've put this modern picture of Pittsburgh up to hopefully give you some idea of really how important this site was. Here's the Monongahela, there's the Allegheny. This is labeled Fort Duquesne, that's where the original fort was. But it is the confluence of these 2 rivers to form the Ohio that allowed Pittsburgh to become the major industrial center that it did. And so again, hopefully that can give us some idea of why this area was so important. Now, the First World War. The real First World War was the 7 Years' War. Many historians have referred to it that way. Winston Churchill called it the First World War. World War I began in August of 1914. The First World War formally began in 1756. It was a global conflict in the Americas, in Europe, in Iberia, Portugal, Spain, in India, in West Africa, and in the West Indies. And it involved battles literally all over the world. If you see these particular areas that have that, whatever color that might be, shows where the areas of conflict occurred. And on the bottom, you can see the countries that participated. On the British side was Prussia, Hanover, the Iroquois Indians, Portugal, Hesse, Brunswick, and Schaumburg. These were German states. This was well before Germany came together as a single country. On the French side, Austria was involved, Russia was involved, Spain, Sweden, Saxony, and the Mughal Empire in India. So it truly was a global war involving battles all over the world. They were on land and they were on sea. The what the end result of all this uh, was that the British won, and the British, as a result of the British winning, the French ceded all of their territory east of the Mississippi. What happened west of the Mississippi would have to wait for Jefferson and Napoleon to take care of. But for all of the French land east of the Mississippi was ceded, they left, and the British had it. The rest, and this brings us to the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that as a result of the French and Indian War, which was the precursor and actually regarded as the trigger for the 7 Years' War, Britain won, but there were difficult circumstances created for Britain. Suffered a massive debt, very much in debt. They spent just untold amounts of money. Because part of the war involved the American colonies, and because the British also were involved in protecting the colonial settlements from hostile Indian tribes that were not allied with Britain, Parliament said, well, it's only fair for the colonists to pay something to help support all this. We spent all this money, much of which has benefited them, but the colonists, the Americans at that point didn't really think that was very interesting to them. They did not want to contribute at all. And we've heard the term taxation without representation. The British imposed or attempted to impose many taxes. You've probably heard of the Stamp Act, maybe you've heard of some other taxes or punitive commercial measures that were meant to raise money for Britain, like Townshend Acts, the Intolerable Acts, some of which arose out of the unrest that occurred as a result. One of the things that led to the unrest was prior to all of this happening in the 7 Years' War and Britain incurring all this expense, really the colonies had been treated with benign neglect. Britain, the Parliament, didn't look after them much, didn't really care a whole lot about what they did or didn't do. But the result of the 7 Year War was that they did care. And the end result was the American Revolution, which I'll talk about. The tensions occurred, of course, and many of which we'll be familiar with, but just an example, Boston Tea Party, December 1773, an example of some of the early tensions and conflict. But then it got much more serious. The Battle of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. And in the Battle of Lexington and Concord, British troops had been sent to seize military supplies that were then called the Patriots, that they believed the Patriots had, particularly in Concord. Well, the Patriots had hidden all of it, so the British could not really find it. But there was a significant battle, and the poem that Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote to commemorate this in the early 1830s, I think, referred to this as the shot heard round the world. And this is regarded as the actual start of the American Revolution. There were other things that followed. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was a successful battle for the British tactically, but it was really pretty much a disaster for them. They seized 1 square mile of territory. 500 of their soldiers were killed. No, I'm sorry, 1,000 of their soldiers were killed. And so it was a kind of one of those victories. If you had many of those type victories, you were going to lose war. All of this led to the Declaration of Independence. You know, I found that many folks tend to think that the Revolutionary War really didn't start till after the Declaration was signed. But really, as I mentioned, it really started in 1775, April of 1775. So we're actually in the 250th year right now of the start of the American Revolutionary War. Areas of conflict. There was the Northern Theater, New England and Canada. The Middle Theater, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Southern Theater, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Britain won some, the Americans won some, but it was touch and go in some of these areas, and particularly touch and go for Washington. He lost or suffered setbacks in more battles than he was successful in. And George was very highly regarded. He's referred to as the indispensable man, but he had no military training. One of the first things he did when he was appointed to be commander-in-chief of the colonial forces, the American forces, was buy 5 or 6 books on military tactics, and he began to study those. So he had to learn on the job, and it was a difficult job. There are many battles of significance, but I'm only going to comment on 2 of them. And I'm also not going to comment on anything involving Georgia. That's going to happen over the next several talks tomorrow. And you'll find out, I'm sure, that Georgia had a very intriguing role in the revolution as to how things developed. But the first battle of significance I'm going to refer to is this is a painting that is supposed to depict Washington after he crossed the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton, where the Americans won. It was extremely significant because up to this time, Washington and his troops, he had experienced some significant setbacks. And morale was a little low. They were having trouble with re-enlistments. But after the Battle of Trenton, and you probably will recall how it began with Washington crossing the Delaware, that famous painting, and where you see him boldly standing in the front of the boat. Well, this encouraged re-enlistments, encouraged the morale, and that helped things a lot. The next battle of significance that I want to comment on is the Battle of Saratoga, and that occurred in 1778. This battle is of particular significance because it resulted in an American victory, and it encouraged the French to become more active with the Americans, to side with them. Up to that time, the French weren't sure what they were going to do. But the French said, well, maybe the Americans can win this after all, so we're going to lend support to them, which was crucial, as we'll talk about it in another moment. So this was another critical battle. Now, there were very, very many battles and important ones up in the New York area and the state of New York, New York City area. But these are the 2 I wanted to particularly focus on for this talk. That brings us to Yorktown. The siege of Yorktown began on September 29th and ended on October 19th, 1781. Now, it was Charles Lord Cornwallis was the British general that was sent to establish a position in Yorktown. He was sent there. He was told that his mission was to find a deep water port in the Chesapeake Bay area where the British ships could come in and unload reinforcements and supplies. And this was important because after the Battle of Saratoga that I just talked about, the British adopted a southern strategy. They said, well, things aren't going as well as we would like in the middle and northern area. So we think we might be able to do more if we went south. We think there would be more loyalists in the South who would support us, and that would give us a chance to establish a foothold. And once we did that, then we could move back north. Well, it didn't turn out that way. They didn't get as much loyalist support as they hoped they would get, but things moved along, and we then come again to Yorktown. The problem with Yorktown for General Cornwallis was that, you see, there was water to the upper part of where he was staying, and both a combination of British and French troops led by Washington and Lafayette came down from the north and settled in around the southern part of this area. Immediately prior to the battles and the siege of Yorktown, in early June, before the siege actually started, there was the Battle of the Chesapeake. And the reason that's important is that the French fleet defeated the English fleet. And what that meant was that the French fleet blockaded that area. British ships could not come in. They could not provide reinforcements. They could not provide supplies. Cornwallis held out for as long as he could, but he finally had to surrender. There were battles on land, of course, before the surrender occurred. But then we get to the surrender after Cornwallis determined that there was no use fighting anymore. And this depicts the surrender. I believe that's supposed to be Lafayette on this painting. That's Lafayette on the left, Washington in the middle. And this is the British officer who was sent to sign the formal letters of surrender. Cornwallis would not come. He said, I'm sick, I can't do it. And now we don't really think he was sick. He just didn't want to do it. He just didn't want to face it. When word got back to Great Britain, the premier of Britain, Great Britain, Prime Minister, heard of Cornwallis's surrender, and his response, he exclaimed, God, it's all over. And he was right. Although the formal end of the war had not occurred yet, the battle of and siege at Yorktown and that victory resulted in the effective end of the American Revolutionary War, with the revolutionaries being successful. Now, getting back to some of the interesting history of this. One, the French and Indian War was triggered by what George Washington did in that battle at Jumonville-Glen, and the subsequent battle at Fort Necessity. Those engagements triggered the First World War, the 7 Years' War. Those events triggered Britain's difficulties and its efforts to impose taxes on America, which triggered the American Revolution, an unusual series of events. The irony, it seems to me, one of the great ironies is that Washington worked with the British in 1754, and his efforts as they moved along in the 1750s, led to the British being able to expel the French. We get to 1781, and actually a bit earlier, but Washington is working with the French, and those efforts working with the French expelled the British from North America, south of Canada, east of the Mississippi. So there is a lot of irony, it seems to me, involved in that. And one of the things that occurred to me thinking about this is that the warp and woof of history is very interesting. Warp and woof refers to the process of weaving, where threads are taken and they are woven into a piece of cloth. Well, I don't think there would be any way in the world that in 1754 George Washington would have thought that the threads of history he was creating would lead to that piece of cloth, but they did. So now you know how George Washington started the First World War, and then you know the rest of the story. And I'm through. Okay. I warn you, if you have questions, my knowledge of history may be broad, but it's not very deep. Any questions? Any comments? Any observations? I know, Leanne, I think, as I said, Georgia's role and what happened in Georgia during the Revolution and during this latter part of the Revolution is pretty interesting and surprising in some ways, isn't it? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, well, he asked about comments. Okay, so you mentioned that George Washington had to get books on warfare, and
Yes.
I had read somewhere that the reason he was chosen as the leader of the military leader was that he kept showing up when the Declaration of Independence was signed, and he had a uniform, and he was taller than everybody
Yes.
else.
Washington said, I don't want to do this. Please don't make me do this. I don't want to be the leader. But he came, in all the meetings, he came to the uniform that he wore during the French and Indian War. And also, Washington, for his time, was an imposing man, 6 feet tall, which was unusual. And he had a special air about him, quietly commanding. And he did not talk a lot, but he was, whatever, his presence caused people to look to him as a leader. And that's how he got the position he did. Although he again said, I really don't want to do this, don't make me do this, don't make me do this, but I'm here in uniform.
He was a wonderful horseman as well. As they said, he sat astride a horse, quite military.
Yes.
And of course, most of them did not have any military experience. He at least had some from the French and Indian War, so I think that was.
And he was very brave, even during the Revolutionary War. This was not an era where generals stayed behind and gave orders. He would be out at the front leading his men. Some battles, the soldiers would, American soldiers would start to form a retreat, get disorganized. He'd ride into the middle of them and say, turn around, we got to go back into the line of fire. And he was shot at a lot and was a very active participant in the battle. So he's a very brave man.
Other questions? Well, as normal in this symposium, we usually have a broad picture on Friday night, and then on Saturday we focus in on state and local events. So tomorrow morning we'll be looking at Georgia and what was happening in Georgia, a little bit at Augusta as well. But we're only going up through, we're not going to go through the whole war because we got 8 years to do that. So we're going to be working on that for a while. But I hope you'll come back. We'll have some coffee and refreshments here at 9. Our first speaker, Dr. Greg Brooking, will start at 9:30, followed by Dr. Michael Morris. Noel has made a nice display of their books. Greg has a book out in 2024 UGA Press on Governor James Wright, the last royal governor of Georgia, and what happens. And when you look at James Wright, you really see the conflict emerging between the Georgians who became patriots and the Georgians who stayed loyal. And in Georgia, it's a generational thing. It's very interesting. Fathers tended to stay loyal. Their sons were patriots. And then Michael will talk about the role of George Golphin. Many of you from around here, some of you probably know Village Golphin Murray, who's a direct descendant. But George Golphin owned a plantation over in South Carolina, from which Springfield Baptist Church came, for example. But he was a very influential trader with the Indians, especially the Creeks, and he was really part of what they wanted the Indians to do is just stay neutral. If you'll just stay neutral and let us fight this out ourselves. And then I will be working with Mark Alberton, and I'll be doing a little bit of history and context, and then he will be doing readings from the primary source materials of people who were in Georgia at the time. So we'll see if that works or not. Y'all can let me know. So I hope you come back in the morning, and thank you for coming. We have a nice reception, and thank you again to Kevin for hosting us here, and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank
Just
you.
one other word. Just remember on Sunday, the Ken Burns series on the Revolution starts.
All right. Please stay and have some refreshments.
Thank you so
Okay.
much, Ray. That was really interesting.
I think we're fortunate that the government shut down. This was